I hope you guys are having an amazing Tuesday morning. I wanted to do my Facebook Live today instead of tomorrow because I want to talk about something at the end that is happening and it is ending today. So I thought I would talk about how anxiety and sensory issues are very much aligned. They are correlated, and they're correlated for a lot of different reasons. So today in my Facebook Live, I'm going to talk to you about why they're connected, how to tell the difference between anxiety caused by sensory or sensory caused by anxiety, because it does matter. They are interconnected and they feed off of each other, but how you're going to approach it and how you're going to help your child is going to look different depending on what is going on with them. So we're going to talk about that relationship. But first, I just want to introduce myself if you don't know who I am. My name is Natasha Daniels, and I am a child therapist, and I'm the admin and creator of this Facebook group and also of the website atparentingsurvival.com. So I'm so glad that you guys can join me. If you're having a hard time hearing me or seeing me, just let me know in the comments. And if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in the comments, and I will try to be somewhat proactive in multitasking, and I will try to read your comments and give you some feedback as we go. I did get a couple of questions from Tracy and Joby and Katie, and I will address those questions at the end so that maybe they're answered as we go. So welcome Amber and welcome Jackie. And I'm going to just jump in because I have a lot I want to share today. And if you have questions as we go, just let me know. So the reason why a lot of kids have sensory issues when they have anxiety is because a lot of times our nervous system is sensitive inside and out. And our anxious kids are emotionally sensitive at times, and they are also physically sensitive, and sometimes they're hyposensitive. So it's not surprising that a lot of our anxious kids are going to have a nervous system that is in overload. They are very much interconnected. Now, you can have kids who have sensory issues and really don't have anxiety, separate from, and this is what I want to get into, separate from anxiety around the sensory. And I'll give you an example of that, and then we'll talk about our anxious kids and their sensory issues. So if I have sensory issues and I hit a bump or a lump in my food and I'm overwhelmed by that sensation, then I am going to get very anxious about eating. And so I might develop an entire anxiety around food, but it's based on sensory input. Does that make sense? So I might have anxiety, but my anxiety is because the overwhelm I'm experiencing because I am orally defensive. So if I'm eating yogurt and there's like a blueberry in it, that's going to freak me out, and I'm going to start avoiding food. Or if things are chewy and I can't break them down and my mouth gets overwhelmed, and I'm going to start to get panicky when I'm eating chewy food. So that could be purely sensory. Now, sometimes it morphs into a full anxiety issue when you have a child who just refuses to eat anything or experience anything, and you're dealing with anxiety, but the trigger, the core fear, is sensory related. So that's where it's purely sensory equals anxiety. Now, unfortunately, for most of our kids, it's not that clear cut. For most of our kids, it is sensory and anxiety. And sometimes anxiety is being caused by sensory, and sometimes anxiety is causing the sensory. And that's where it gets really confusing. Because if I'm an anxious kid and my world is overwhelming, that's going to add to my anxiety. So the way that I can tell the difference is if I have anxiety things that are not related to sensory. That's how I can tell the difference if a child has a true anxiety disorder or a major anxiety issue, and then the sensory is a separate component that is feeding into it. So if I'm afraid at night and I'm afraid to go to sleep and I'm afraid of separating from you, or I'm afraid I'm going to throw up, or I'm afraid of what other people think, I have all those things going on, plus the tags are killing me and I can't wear jeans and the socks are bothering me, and noises are overwhelming and crowds are overwhelming, then I'm just an anxiety sensory kid and I've got both going on. So most of us have both. I think most of us have both. And the hard part is trying to figure out how to interject different approaches and skills and techniques depending on what the issue is. And I'll explain why. So if I have a child who has anxiety, and if you've heard me talk at all, if you listen to my podcast or my YouTube channel or anything, then, and Jennifer, I'm going to get to your question in 1 second, then you've heard me say before, you want to eventually teach your kids to lean into the anxiety. We want them to acclimate, we want them to get desensitized, and we want them to be empowered to eventually overcome their anxiety. Now, the hard part is when it's sensory, you can't really overly desensitize and overcome sensory issues. That's too tricky. It's a physiological thing. My kids are going to still feel those bumps and lumps. They might be able to adapt to it, but it's still going to be harder for them. And so they really are two completely different things and how you're going to approach them. I'm going to go into that and talk about coping mechanisms and how to help your kids. But Jennifer asked, she said, my 12-year-old with anxiety always wants full body hugs, kind of an on-demand and several times a day. I don't mind hugging him, but I know it's related to his anxiety and possible OCD. And then she also wrote, he's always had sensory issues with the tags and clothes and food, only using certain cups and utensils. The tricky part is you want to make sure, this is the hard part when we have just a mush of anxiety, OCD, and sensory. And most, I don't want to say most of us, but a lot of us have all three playing together, or at least two of them. So I would be careful with the hugs because I have seen hugs are a compulsion. So if you have a child who has moral OCD and worries that you don't love them, sometimes the reassurance is the hug. They eventually stop doing the confessions and they just move to giving you a hug. So I would watch the timing of the hugs. And I have done with kids that I have worked with where we absolutely know it's a compulsion, we will schedule hugs. And I know that sounds completely weird, but if it's a compulsion, you're completing the OCD loop and you're growing the OCD, and you don't want that. So I have worked with kids where we'll say the parent will randomly hug them instead. Now, if it's sensory, that's tricky. I've noticed that when I have kids that are, and my own kids too, when they are like overwhelmed sensory-wise and they're bouncing off the walls, they need to be grounded. And so they're looking for that deep pressure hug. They don't ask for it, but I will go over it and I will give it to them. So Jennifer, I would say to you, just pay attention to the patterns of what he's doing and why he's wanting certain utensils and cups, because that could be an OCD thing as well. I like to play detective with my kids. I'm observing them all the time, probably too much, to look at these patterns and say what's anxiety, what's OCD, and what's sensory. So Jennifer asked, what's the difference between sensory, anxiety, and autism? I don't know if you can separate those in that way. Autistic kids or kids on the spectrum tend to have more sensory issues. So they are much more likely to be sensitive to noise and to, all of the sensory things that happen when you have sensory issues. And then you can get anxious about those sensory issues. I don't know if there's a difference, except for the fact that when you're on the spectrum, you're much more likely to have that sensory component and to have anxiety as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Angela said, can you explain the confessions? Okay, well, this isn't about OCD, so I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. I could absolutely do more Facebook Lives on OCD, and I have a zillion podcast episodes on OCD as well. But, when you have a child who has moral OCD, which makes them feel like they're a bad kid and that they've done bad things, which they haven't in reality, they will have to confess to their parent and say, Mom, I think that, I might have 2 years ago stolen a piece of gum from your purse. And then that's kind of the confession. And then the parent would say, oh, honey, don't worry about that, because they don't realize that it's OCD. So I don't want to get into that. I do have a podcast episode on that. My podcast is the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. You can go check that out or look at my website. And there's a search button at the very bottom of my website at atparentingsurvival.com. And just type in moral OCD and you're going to find all about that. So Kelsey, nice to see you here, Kelsey. She said, could the sensory chewing instead be an OCD compulsion? I wouldn't think so, but I don't know your child. I don't typically see chewing as a compulsion, but you can have compulsions that I've never seen before. Typically chewing is oral input. So normally when I'm seeing compulsions, they are very finite. There's a beginning, middle, and end. So if I have a compulsion and I have to touch my nose twice, it's going to be a beginning, middle, and end. I'm going to touch it, I'm going to be done. I might have to do it multiple times, but you're going to see a beginning, middle, and end. Chewing is just this ongoing habit. So I would think that's more sensory related. Jennifer said, yeah, I get that totally. Thanks, Natasha. Working with his therapist on it and scheduling hugs doesn't sound weird at all. Good. It might have years ago, but no longer. And I like that about paying attention to the patterns. Yeah. With OCD, you really have to like be super careful about knowing what is a compulsion. Tiffany wrote, I suspect my son has sensory issues and I'm honestly not sure how to help him and figure out what exactly his sensory needs are. He has ADHD, OCD, anxiety, and Tourette's. Do you see more sensory issues in those with Tourette's? That's a really good question. You know, it's across the board, not always, but a lot of times when they have multiple diagnoses, they're going to have the sensory component too, because it's just part of that mix. And just want to make sure I answer your question. I'm not sure how to help him and figure out what exactly are his sensory needs. I pay attention, and it takes time. And I'll give you an example. So my son, who's 9, you know, so my oldest daughter is 15 and she has sensory processing disorder. She has SPD. She had feeding therapy before she could even walk. She's had OT. She has severe sensory issues. And she's 15 and she's doing great. And I'll talk about how to get them on that path. But my 9-year-old, he has anxiety and OCD. And really, I wouldn't say he's necessarily a sensory kid. And my youngest has anxiety and a little bit of OCD. And she has her sensory issues too, but neither of them have what I would diagnose as SPD. And yet, I watch them and I realize that they have a lot of sensory needs. And so you want to pay attention to your son and just observe. Like my son was going around and he was driving us all nuts because he appeared very hyperactive. He's been lately bouncing off the walls, but it's not his like baseline. And so I was like, what is going on with him? And I was watching him bury himself under pillows. And I was watching him, like just last week, pushing up against the cabinets and taking the bar stool and hanging from it and hanging upside down. And eventually I was like, gosh, he is looking for sensory input. He was being like hyposensitive. He needed more input. And so I kept on hugging him. And it was kind of weird because he's not a hugger, but then he would melt into it. And I would say, let me just hug you. And I kept on hugging him every day. And I was doing like some deep pressure, like joint compressions, and he was melting and he needed that. Now I could have just been like, oh my gosh, and my husband was just like, he is just out of control. He looked like he has he does not have ADHD, but he looked like it because he needed that sensory input. He doesn't always need it, but I was paying attention. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. Angela said, one of my daughter's first issues was confessing her thoughts. So you definitely look into that so you can learn more about that. Tiffany said, how can you tell if meltdown is anxiety-based, sensory-based, or just a tantrum and misbehavior? Such a good question. These are so good. I don't even need my notes because I'm just going to base it on your questions. That's tricky, right? That is a very tricky thing. A lot of times I try to pay attention to what's happened right before. So if my kid, and obviously I sound like I'm Mother Teresa, but I am so far from Mother Teresa. These are the things that I intend to do, right? I do them like 30% of the time, maybe less. But when we have the intention and your child's melting down and you are like in a Zen mom mode where you are not flipping out, which we all have that moment, I try to think what just happened, like what happened before this meltdown to see if I can connect the dots. Is it out of the blue? If a meltdown is totally out of the blue and unprovoked, like you handed them a red cup and they normally are okay with the red cup and now they're on the floor bawling about the red cup, it's not about the red cup. So obviously there's something, either sensory overload, anxiety going on. And the hard part is it's cumulative. So you can have a kid who's been in school all day, has had to sit in a desk, and has been overloaded by a lot of chaos and noise and maybe some anxiety issues. They come home and they're here, and then you just say, go get your homework, and they're like, and that's the tricky part. I will do another Facebook Live down the road on just how to handle difficult behavior. I've done them before, and I'll do them again because I want to go into how to help with that, but I want to stay on topic today. Jennifer said, or Tiffany, a way to manipulate you because of anxiety. Yeah, and even if they're manipulating you, you still want to approach it like, what's going on? Like, why are they manipulating you? And I think setting firm boundaries, in a loving sort of way, whether it's anxiety or not, is a good thing. And so a lot of times people think that those are conflicting, that I'm going to be either disciplining you or addressing your anxiety. And I think you can do both. My daughter, not to keep talking about my kids, but my 7-year-old, she's been off the hook lately because she is not sleeping well. And so she's having a lot of bad dreams. And so she's really sleep deprived. And around 5 or 6 at night, she turns into a demon child, like literally. Her head starts to spin and we all get really freaked out. She's not okay. And I'm still disciplining her though, because she needs to know there's boundaries. So she can't talk to me in a crazy way or throw things or hit things or whatever, but I'll do it in a loving way. I'll be like, you're not okay, but it's not okay to throw things. And if you're going to throw things, you need to go into a safe place, go to your room and relax. So I'm still setting boundaries. It's not okay to act that way, but I'm doing it in a loving way. And I'm also calling out the behavior. And I'll say, you're like this because you're not okay. And you're not okay because you're tired. So I'm helping them connect the dots, but I'm still not okay with accepting that behavior. So hopefully that makes sense. I just want to make sure let's see. Tiffany said, yes, I feel like that too. Angela said our VT recommended ankle weights or grounding. And you want to play with that with your child and see what helps. I think a lot of sensory stuff can really help. It's trial and error. You want your child to like it. So I was actually even thinking about getting my son a weighted just lap blanket because he has a big one, but I'm thinking even just like while he's sitting around, just putting it on him. We have little trampolines at my house. We have a zillion sensory chew toys at my house. So play with that and find what works for your kids. Eric said, my 9-year-old daughter, or it's Victoria, I'm not sure. My 9-year-old daughter has been like that. I'll hug her more. Thank you. Yeah, deep hugs are really helpful. And I'll tell you, like with my daughter, my 7-year-old, who has some really not beautiful behavior right now, my intuition or my gut reaction to her is not to hug her because she's having really ugly, prickly behavior. She's a porcupine. And the last thing I am feeling like I want to do is hug her. And she doesn't look like she wants a hug. She's being super nasty. But I will say to her, come here, can I give you a hug? Ask for permission because otherwise you might get hit in the face. And I'll say, can I give you a hug? And she will melt into those hugs. Now my oldest is really not touchy-feely. She would not. But my youngest, it ends her meltdowns right away when I hug her. So definitely play with that. And that's not because I'm just giving her love. I'm giving her sensory input. So that can be helpful. Amber wrote, I'm also interested in this as my 4-year-old has multiple meltdowns every day and I want to address them correctly. Yeah, and I think like what we're saying and how we're talking about it is how to approach it. I don't try to contain the meltdown, and this isn't about meltdowns today, but I don't try to control their emotions. It's okay for them to emote, right? It's okay for them to do that, but it's not okay for them to hurt other people or to be disruptive. And so letting kids just flail sometimes is what they need to do to get it out, but sometimes they want that cocooning. Sometimes they want that input. So Fatima wrote, my 9-year-old with ASD, OCD, ODD, GAD, it's a lot of abbreviations, gets very happy. When he gets very happy, he presses his teeth very hard along, pressing his hands together hardly. And if we are around him, he tries to grab us and press hard. It's not a proper hug. This is something sensory for him. I think that sounds more on the spectrum. I see kids with spectrum needs kind of use you as a tool to get their input. So Jennifer wrote, oh my gosh, the red cup, I can so relate. It's my life. Jennifer wrote, Natasha, wish you were my therapist so I could ask you what to do some days. Thanks so much. Well, you can ask here. So I'm not your therapist, but input is a good thing. I want to get also to questions that people left on the thread. Katie wanted to talk about clothing. She said her problem is that her child lives in a very cold place and they have to wear these big clothes at recess. She's been at a loss on how to support her daughter when she really needs to wear them, and she has to be the enforcer. And I think the tricky part really with sensory stuff, and I was going to say this anyway, is that their skin is not necessarily going to adapt. And so like with my 15-year-old, I had to become a huge shopper with my hands. I mean, we would buy stuff and we'd have to return most of it. I saved the receipts. When I found a shirt that she liked, I'd buy like 15 of them in all different colors. And so it might take you some detective work to find, can I find warm clothes that are sensory friendly? Because a lot of times we think our kids need to get over it, they need to adapt. And really with sensory issues, we, the parents, have to adapt. We have to find clothing that works for their skin, because it's a physiological issue. So we have to find earplugs or headphones that work for their ears. So I look at sensory different than I look at anxiety. I feel like in sensory, I try to understand them and I try to give them adaptive tools. You know, my daughter who's 15, she still shops with her fingers and not her eyes. I mean, I'm sure her eyes have something to do with it, but she is feeling things nonstop. So that's what I would say to Katie is try to find something that's soft on the inside and help your child figure out what she can tolerate. Joby also wrote that her 8.5-year-old sensory issues are a big contributor to anxiety. She's especially affected by loud noises, laughing, crying. I think that sensitivity to noise is part of the reason why she is shy and uncomfortable. She gets distracted. Any suggestions on what she can do at school? I think when you have, and some kids don't have sensory issues, sometimes some kids have misophonia. I have a whole podcast on misophonia, or Google it and learn about that because that is different and it can look very similar. So if it's just noise and particular noises, you might want to look into that. I have worked with kids who have gotten 504 plans who live in the States purely for sensory issues or purely for anxiety or both. I like Vibes. They are expensive and they are tiny, and so they can get lost, but they fit really nicely into little ears and you can still hear with them, but they're just easy to use and they're very discreet and they are meant for sensory issues, and kids with autism and sensory issues use them. So that could be an option. And also talk to your school about a 504 plan where they can have some accommodations as well. So we have to wrap up because we only have 5 more minutes, but I want to get to some of these questions. Laura said, my 10-year-old likes to sit on my lap and be rocked to feel safe and calm down. Is that okay? Yeah, I think that's good that you're giving her sensory input. Jennifer says, thank you. This is great. Thank you, Jennifer. You're so awesome. Oh my, we do the exact same thing. He wears the same pair of pants. We have 8 pairs and only very certain shirts. That's my life. I mean, we will buy with shoes. I will buy them in the current size and I'll buy them in the one size up. Like we buy in bulk. Kelly said, my 9.5-year-old often still uses baby talk and acts younger than she is. I think it's all linked to her anxiety and going back to a time and place when she felt safe, but it drives me nuts. How do you deal with baby talk and acting younger than your child is? Just go with it and hope they stop one day. This is not a sensory topic, but Kelly, I'll answer it really quickly. We all have pet peeves. Baby talk is one of my biggest pet peeves. It drives me nuts. In my house, and even with the kids I work with in my practice, I will say, I can't hear baby talk. Or I'll be like, I can't hear you. I only hear big girl voice. So, and your child's 9.5, so you don't have to even use young words like that. I would just say, use your regular voice. I can't hear you. Use your regular voice. I can't hear you. When they do that, they quickly get out of that behavior. So I think it is something worth to address because I have seen 20-year-olds with baby talk and it's not pretty. So Tiffany said, the longer I listen to you, I'm finding I have my own sensory issues. I totally have sensory issues. It's scary. I cut my tags out. I can't wear jeans. Well, I have this one. I found a good brand, but like they have to be soft. Tiffany said, sorry, me again. One more question. Anxiety and sensory overload is our life. My daughter has gone through OT and continues therapy for anxiety and is doing better at regulating herself. She comes home from school and basically hangs out in her basement by herself and wants to be left alone when we ask. Sometimes she's just in the dark. Is this her way of dealing with sensory overload? She's a 3rd grader. I would think maybe. I mean, I don't know her, so I want to make sure that she's not isolating and sad. But I think some kids just need, turn off the sensory input. So maybe. I also want to get to Tracy's question. She said transitions are hard for her 8-year-old and triggers meltdowns, anger, aggression. And then she said both her kids, 8 and 10, when it's time to go and get ready and go somewhere fun, they go nuts. They can't get anything done. They bounce off the walls. They fight. They play hard. They get very loud. They spin in circles. They literally spin. Is this anxiety or sensory? And I think this is the whole chicken or the egg thing. I think when kids are anxious, they sensory seek. Like my 9-year-old, when he's anxious or overwhelmed, he looks hyperactive. And so I don't know your kids, Tracy, but I would think that that could be if you're only seeing it in that time during transitions or when they're anxious. And that's another topic as far as how to address transitions. That's a good topic for me to talk about down the road. All right, let me just make sure I get to all your questions. Lynn says it sounds like my daughter too. How do you spell misophonia? M-I-S-O. Jennifer, M-I-S-O, phonia, P-H-O-N-I-A. I'm not good at spelling out loud, so I never did a spelling bee. Laura said, what do you know about slow processing speed? We're not going to talk about processing issues today because that is something totally different, and I'm sure Lynn can probably talk about that as well. And I need to wrap it up, so I just want to make sure I get to some questions. Amber Rain replied to Kelly Coster, I'm no expert, but I think this is normal behavior for most kids. Kelly, thanks. I don't want this to still be going on when she's 20. You know, and we want to be careful because a lot of times when we chalk up a lot of stuff as normal, this is just normal kid behavior, we miss an opportunity to be proactive. And so a lot of times the things that we're going to do to address these issues, even if they were going to grow out of them, isn't going to make or break their progress as far as hurting them. It can only help kids. And I feel like a lot of times I've watched parents wait too long and say this is normal kid behavior when I've talked about anxiety or sensory issues, and they've kind of missed that window to be super proactive, because the earlier you get in there and help your kids understand things, the better they're going to do. So like I had a pediatrician once who was always like, this is normal behavior. Miss Daniels, this is normal behavior. And if I had listened to him, my daughter literally would have starved to death because she was going off the feeding curve and she was not eating. And he said, no child's ever going to starve to death. And I brought her back, you know, like 5 months later, and she was starving to death. So you want to be careful with, you know, chalking it up to normal behavior too much, or even having pediatricians or families and friends telling you, you know, my kid did that once. You know, the things that we're talking about, anxiety, OCD, and sensory, yes, all kids do those things, but they don't do them to the level that our kids do them. So giving them coping mechanisms, giving them adaptive skills, that's not going to hurt anybody. It's only going to help. So I just wanted to address that. If you are feeling like you need more sensory support, this is why I wanted to go on today instead of tomorrow, because today is the last day for Sensory Solutions class, which I left a link in the thread. And my friends Alicia and Wendy are doing this online course for sensory, and I know some of you need that. I don't do a lot of sensory work, and so if you're looking for more information, how to do sensory diet, how to approach kids in sensory ways, check out their class. And if you like these Facebook Lives, I do them once a month. Normally it's the last Wednesday of every month in this group, but I do them every single week in my AT Parenting Community private Facebook group. And I do live coaching calls as well. So if you want more and you're like, oh gosh, this is kind of a nice thing, I do it every single week in there, and you can check out my community at atparentingcommunity.com. I left a link above as well. So hopefully I got to most of your questions. And Jennifer said, that's my big fear, missing my opportunity for my kids to help them. If you're here and you are working on things, you're not missing any opportunities. I think sometimes we can swing into the other direction and really worry. And I think it's important to know, like, you're doing what you can and your eyes are open. And I think when our eyes are open and we're paying attention to our kids and we're watching their behavior and we're not chalking things up and dismissing them, you're doing awesome. So I hope you guys all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you again next month. Take care.